So as early as August 1789, James Wodrow wrote, "With greater prescience than many commentators so early in the Revolution, what think you of the state of France? I had flattered myself that a grand and glorious revolution in favour of liberty would have been effected without bloodshed, and that it would have made the tyrants of Europe tremble on their thrones. But now I see the purchase must be made by blood. The Terres États seem to have lost their influence, and France, from one end of the kingdom to the other, to be under the power of an enraged mob, the most dreadful of tyrants." So what's been called the British debate on the French Revolution was for many years characterised by historians most commonly as a bipolar, conservative, radical reformist debate. In recent decades, that's been complicated by historians by the insertion of what we might call a liberal position between the conservatives and the radical reformers, by the disputing of all of those labels, conservative, liberal, and radical, and by the recognition that rather than there being a debate on the French Revolution in Britain, and indeed, rather than British commentators even falling into fixed camps, there was a significant degree of flux in what people were saying about the revolution. And this fluidity of opinion was caused by the development of events in France, by the changing context of events in Britain, and by individuals, therefore, completely understandably changing their minds as the decade progressed. As Mark Philp has argued compellingly, we don't require consistency of ourselves. It's unfair to demand it in historical figures who, like us, responded as life moved on. So I want to concentrate this afternoon on presenting to you the worked example of the letters between James Wodrow, this figure behind me, a church minister in Ayrshire in southwest Scotland, and his great friend Samuel Kenrick, by this time a banker who lived near Birmingham. And the fluidity of Wodrow's and Kenrick's views on the revolution in France was certainly influenced by the changing events in France, changing events in Britain. But we can also see that the development of their thinking was heavily influenced by at least three other factors. And I think this makes them a really fascinating case study of factors that we often presume to shape people's thinking, but less often have the opportunity to examine. Their temperament or character, their mutual discussion, and what they read. And all of this, I think, makes them a wonderful example of what we've been calling living the Enlightenment. So I'm going to start by introducing them and their correspondence, and eventually I want to settle on their discussion of what they read on the French Revolution conversation in Britain. So the letters that I'm talking about here, and these are the first two volumes, we don't have an image of Kenrick. I'm really, really sad about this. So the poor man has to be represented by his handwriting on one of his letters, but there we are. But the letters that I'm talking about form part of this almost lifelong correspondence that Jean-Francois kindly mentioned, of James Wodrow, the parish minister of Stevenston in Ayrshire, and his great friend Samuel Kenrick, who was originally from Wales, and by this time, as I say, was living in Worcestershire. It comprises nearly 300 surviving letters written between 1750 and 1810, totaling nearly 500,000 words, pretty evenly distributed between both men. Sorry, there is Wodrow. That's where Kenrick was born. This is the distribution of the letters, and maybe I get out of the way for a moment to let you see those, pretty evenly distributed between them. They'd met as students at Glasgow University in the 1740s, and we think they began writing to each other in 1748. They continued all the way until Wodrow's death in 1810. You can see there are gaps, big gap here, during which Kenrick moved back down to England. He'd graduated in 1747, I think. He had remained as a tutor to a wealthy family in Renfrewshire, just north of Glasgow. But in 1765, he went down south, joined his brother in business, and they didn't see each other ever again except on 2 occasions. James Wodrow once made a journey down to London, 1788, and he stayed with the Kenrick family on the way down and again on the way back up home again, and that's it. So from 1768 onwards, the whole of their friendship is what we have on paper, which is unusual, right? And it's a wonderful opportunity. The letters are held, if you're interested, in the Dr. Williams's library, which has been in London. Unfortunately, they're having to move out of that building. I can talk about that later. They will be held in Manchester. They do exist on microfilm, but that's it. So this project is published in the hope of making them more widely accessible. And the letters are typically articulate, they are vivid, they're pithily well written, and although they don't always provide all of the details of their lives that we might like to have, they don't shy away from expressing and discussing their emotions, their care and affection for each other and their families and friends, their pain, their joy, their humour, terrific for the history of emotions. It's not a carefully curated of literary epistles written with an eye to some future publicity, rather the embodiment of a genuine friendship on paper in which each writer could make himself vulnerable to his correspondent, knowing he would be received with kindness and understanding, even if his politics might be challenged without mercy. Their mutual affection never dimmed. By late 1797, now into his well into his 60s, Wodrow was dispensing with more formal closing greetings and simply employing the modern-sounding "love to you and yours," while Kenrick's closing salutation of choice in later years was very often the affectionate "tout à vous." In one of his last letters, written in June 1809, Wodrow wrote that in reading Kenrick's last, he'd been reminded of the celebrated friendship of David and Jonathan. So this is where I'm going. The yellow bits are the bits that I will sit down on a little bit more at length. I'm going to spend a little bit of time just locating the French Revolutionary correspondence in the years up to 1787. In the rest of the correspondence, I will do a little bit on what they agreed about, disagreed about, and I really want to sit down on what they had to read and how they discussed it. So where does this section of the correspondence sit? By the time of the fall of the Bastille, Wodrow was 59 years old and Kenrick was 61. They'd known each other for nearly 50 years. They'd been writing letters to each other for nearly 40 of those. They knew each other very well. They'd watched each other grow up, get married, have children, develop careers, deal with trauma and tragedy, form deeply held convictions about politics and religion. What they're best known for now, for instance, in the work of my colleague Martin Fitzpatrick and also in the work of Florence Petrov at La Rochelle University here, is their disagreement on the American Revolution, in which Wodrow had taken the loyalist side as against Kenrick's sympathy with the American revolutionaries. And that debate fueled some of their longest and most engaging letters as they first tried to persuade each other of their opinion and then realizing that that was not going to happen, tried to persuade each other that they weren't a bad person for holding those views. And some of those letters are really very long. They run to 8,000 or 9,000 words as they're trying to make the argument. And that exercise proved intellectually challenging and stimulated them to employ their wide reading in a lengthy, rational, candid correspondence that's a model of Enlightenment discourse. The correspondence on the French Revolution doesn't follow quite the same pattern. They're certainly electrified by it, and they also consistently disagreed about it. They also write about it at length. There are a lot of letters in this period, nearly 70 between August 1789 and December 1797, and 5 more which are missing. But their discussion is different from the letters of America in a number of respects. First, although they wrote very substantially about it, there aren't any long stretches of very long letters which really only talk about the French Revolution. Rather, they consider events in France in relation to a number of events and causes in Britain that were important to them. And in that, I think they're wholly characteristic of Britons discussing the French Revolution. British people curated a series of events which they called the discussion on the French Revolution, but quite a lot of those events happened in Britain. And second, they didn't disagree so diametrically about France as they had about America, because the issues at stake were different. But I think also it reflects their experience of disagreeing radically with each other in the 1770s. Wodrow acknowledged that history had proven him wrong in the earlier struggle. And finally, as men of the Enlightenment, by the mid-1790s, they were discouraged. I mentioned this book the other day, but I think their story fits Richard Whatmore's End of Enlightenment thesis rather well. So this is the proposal that the Enlightenment project of reshaping society towards toleration and peace by means of reason and away from superstition and war caused by religious fanaticism was believed even by its proponents to have failed by the end of the 18th century, as the world was now swept by political fanaticism, terror, conspiracies and violence. Wodrow and Kenrick had hoped that France would lead the way in ending political despotism, that the British government of William Pitt the Younger would bring about a greater degree of political liberty, especially for dissenters from the established Church of England, and that religious bigotry was dying out. But in the early 1790s, one reform cause after another was rejected or stalled by Parliament. Religious persecution continued in England and Scotland, and the revolution in France turned violent. Nonetheless, one of their favourite conclusions was nil desperandum, however, de republica or de libertate. Where are they disagreeing? Actually, let me just come back to that in a moment. Very briefly, they both welcomed the emergence of liberty in France, especially by contrast with British failures to embrace it on behalf of enslaved people or the Protestant dissenters and so on. Wodrow wrote in April 1791, "The spirit of reformation and improvement which has produced such glorious and I hope permanent effects in France, singular indeed or unparalleled in the history of mankind, this spirit appears to me to be retrograde in Britain." And it's important to say that because it's reasonably easy to see Wodrow as the cautious pragmatist, if not pessimist, always a bit worried about the values of the mob. Kenrick, by temperament, was a massive enthusiast, and it's not surprising that he was optimistic in the early years of the revolution about its trajectory and eventual vindication. "This is an interesting time," he wrote in April 1791. "I long for the event, but have not the least doubt, whether I see it or no, that the cause of truth, virtue and pure religion will triumph at last. I clearly see the dawn of a glorious day approaching." They both also opposed the war. They wanted Britain to negotiate its way out of it as soon as possible. They always saw war as the bringer of human misery. They were critical of the severity of the British government in the trials, repressing political radicalism at home, and they were both also appalled by the terror in France. But here's the quotation I wanted to land on. A summary by Wodrow a few years later in September 1794, let me get out of the way again, as they were heading into their period of worst disagreement of the decade, flags both what united them and his assessment of the root of their differences. "I see we have at bottom the same views of the guilt, folly and madness of war, the grand error of nations, as good Dr. Price, Richard Price, calls it, the same views of the tendency of the prosecutions at home to irritate and inflame instead of conciliating the minds of men, and of the probable consequences of the present measures if they are long continued, viz. The depression of the nation, if not the dissolution of the British government, which must happen whenever the mob are either suffered or driven to undertake the delicate task of reforming it." The main point at issue between them was in fact the extent to which they blamed the British government and the French government from later in 1792. And that would sound familiar to anybody who knows their letters on the American Revolution. But this time it wasn't a zero-sum game, because this time Wodrow was critical of both the British government and the French. In 2 published fast-day sermons that he preached and printed in 1794, instead of doing what many British loyalist preachers did in holding up Britain as the mirror image of what they called the follies and wickedness of the French, he dealt first with the British and then with the French, criticising both. Whereas Kenrick was much more inclined to blame the Pitt administration and to defend the French revolutionaries as more sinned against than sinning. He was much more obsessed with the conduct of the state trials for treason and sedition in Britain, and he ridiculed the British government's attempts to arm the country for local defence, while Wodrow was more likely to worry about the danger posed by the mob and about the invasion threat from France. And really, they only came close to crosswords in winter 1794-5, which, to be fair, was a bad winter. And the end of this quotation gives you the taste of that, as Wodrow accused Kenrick, "The only difference between us is the bitterness and violence of your feelings." So occasionally there could be what we might describe as real crosswords, but even that I think they would have described as Enlightenment candour. They never actually fall out. And within a couple of months of that comment, Wodrow was conceding that he'd been wrong on America and by extension might not necessarily be right this time. Otherwise, they were remarkably well-tempered, despite disagreeing quite markedly, and if we want to discuss that later on, how they managed that, we can do that. But let me move on to where they got their information. They're always keen for information, and they acquire it from a range of sources. Certainly, they each expected the other to pass on any news that they were getting from either end of the country. My best thanks for all the anecdotes you've given me relative to the present situation and the struggles of the dissenters with their numerous and bigoted adversaries. These it was impossible for me to have learned from any other source than your pen. That's Wodrow-Kenrick. Their favoured source of book reviews for 45 years had been a periodical called the Monthly Review. But in Kenrick's view, it was beginning to cover political material less frequently by 1794, no doubt because of the harassment of authors, printers and publishers through legal means by then, while Wodrow felt that it didn't sufficiently offer both sides of the argument to let him make up his mind. I love that about Wodrow. He needs to hear both sides of the argument, and, that's wonderful. In any case, Kenrick advised Wodrow to start taking Benjamin Flower's weekly Cambridge Intelligencer instead, which he arranged for his friend. And that suited Wodrow very well. As Kenrick said, it's written with spirit but great decency, dreadfully severe on Robespierre's party and measures. Wodrow enjoyed it very much, although his criticism was different. It's a judicious, sensible, spirited paper, great source of entertainment to me, possibly from coincidence of sentiment in most points, especially respecting the French and the desperate consequences of persisting in the present war. And again, I love that he is a little bit doubting of himself, that he likes this paper because he agrees with it, and he wants to make sure that he's hearing 360 degrees. Yet he is critical. His abuse of the ministry and this and other matters is too strong, approaching towards indecency and scurrility once or twice. His satire would be more poignant were it less coarse. Kenrick also took the Critical Review and the Monthly Magazine. He was even aware of the Scots Chronicle, a short-lived Whig paper. Both of them were inveterate newspaper readers. Wodrow in particular regularly referred to our newspapers, or the Glasgow newspapers. Probably he most regularly saw the Glasgow Journal. And there are letters in this period which suggest that they are scouring the newspapers, very thoroughly. There's a letter at the end of May 1792 in which I think Wodrow discusses every single parliamentary debate on a strictly political topic that had occurred since he last wrote to Kenrick at the end of March. So, redress for the victims of the Priestley riots in 1791 in Birmingham, the abolition of the slave trade, local government reform in Scotland, parliamentary reform in Westminster, Charles James Fox's Libel Act, as well as the formation of the Association of the Friends of the People by progressive Whig MPs, the Royal Proclamation against seditious writings. And from these periodicals, they quoted and summarised a wide range of books liberally for each other. They sent each other pamphlets and books, and of course, they not only read reviews of a wide range of titles, pulling back the curtain on what we all do when we haven't got enough time to read the books themselves, but they also carefully read and discussed a good number of volumes as well. And all of that I wanted to lay out before you, however briefly, to establish what kind of readers they were, wide-ranging and thoughtful. I'm going to get into how they read just in a moment. So what I want to do next is to set their bilateral correspondence in a pattern that my PhD student Josh Smith has recently established in his thesis on thinking about what he's called the politics of reading in terms of a number of models. So he looked at a solitary individual leaving traces of his reading in library borrowings and in notes in his journal about what he'd read. He looked at the clergymen and divinity students leaving borrowing records in the context of secular and ecclesiastical political events, the Leighton Library in Dunblane near Stirling. The statistics of borrowings in an urban library in one highly charged political year, 1812, in Bristol, the Library Society in Bristol, and the internal machinations, the borrowings, the operation of both libraries against the lead up to parliamentary reform in 1832. And I think that Wodrow's and Kenrick's remarkably substantial bilateral correspondence between two sophisticated political readers could be considered as another model in that spectrum of political reading. But I want to put it first in the context of their letters on her political reading of another writer. So elsewhere, I've discussed how the study of an individual's successive reading of events and of some seminal books on the French Revolution illuminates how British opinion on the Revolution was formed and developed over time in the context of the person, or rather in the person of Anna Seward, a poet. I don't have time to say a lot about her just now, but let me just very quickly summarise. She came from a pre-revolution standpoint of general sympathy with the opposition Foxite Whig party in Parliament. So she was doubly disposed to be enamoured with the letters from France published by her friend, Helen Maria Williams, who was staying in Paris in November 1790. And this book, as Seward said, showed her the sunny side of the French Revolution, as opposed to the darkness, clouds and shadows thrust upon it by Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France, published in the same month. And she put off reading Burke's book as long as she could. She didn't want to read it. But in fact, she felt obliged to read it by mid-December, and reluctantly, she found its analysis compelling. So compelling, in fact, that neither Thomas Paine's Rights of Man Part 1, nor any of the other early replies to Burke persuaded her otherwise, even if she quite enjoyed their criticism of some of Burke's more egregiously florid passages. By late 1791, however, her confidence in Burke's pessimistic analysis had been weakened, and it wasn't until war looked likely in late 1792 that reluctantly again she felt she had to support the Pitt administration in its resistance to revolutionary France. And in April 1793, her message to those who were still dissatisfied with the British Constitution, even in the light of violence in France, was blunt. America is accessible. In other words, if you don't like it here, off you go. But from mid-1794, she was impatient with the continuation of the war, and she was persuaded again by the Foxite case that William Pitt and his colleagues were perpetuating the war for their own gain, and she never returned to supporting the government. And discussing her changes of opinion over the war, Seward told a correspondent in November 1796, this is quite a characteristic comment of hers, "You will perhaps think," and I want to put in square brackets by now, "I am wading beyond my depth when I thus write to you of politics, but I am not too proud to confess myself mistaken beneath the force of such disastrous proofs of it exhibited by this ruinous war. Time is a broad mirror which often shows us the fallacy of our own judgment." And what I want to suggest from her is not, of course, that she suffered from a feminine inability to make up her mind, but rather that she was blessed by the ability to follow events and to admit with great candour when she changed her mind, either as the issues changed or, for my purposes today, as what she was reading convinced her. So back to Wodrow and Kenrick. Of the 20 plus discrete pamphlet publications on the revolution in France that Wodrow and Kenrick discussed during these 7 or 8 years, 15 were very commonly read, and these 10 were publications that I think can be viewed not only as responses to events, but we might even view them as capital E events in themselves, in the British collective narrative of these years. And Wodrow's and Kenrick's discussion of these books, I want to argue, constitute both evidence of reading and discussion of reading as significant influences that shaped people's opinions on events in France and at home, and part of the evidence of the British curation of a collective narrative of events in these years. They didn't discuss each of these books equally, of course, and you'll be relieved to know that neither am I going to, neither at equal length nor in equal depth, and nor did even of them actually discuss every text. But what I think is highly telling is that these publications, which I would guess would figure in the top 12 or 15 publications in any British 1790s scholars' political publishing events of the period, I think it's highly telling that they figure in their list of books mentioned and evaluated. So first of all, what can we say about this list itself? First, I think it's worth remarking on the fact that 7 of the 10 were on the radical reform end of the spectrum. So Kenrick was a massive fan of Joseph Priestley, the polymath who had lived in Birmingham. He was a scientist, political economist, a religious reformer, a political reformer. So not surprising he's on the list. They're both great admirers of Richard Price, demographer, economist, political reformer, religious reformer. Wodrow had met him and was personally sent a copy of Price's discourse in 1790. And Burke and Payne were both provocateurs whose books could really not be ignored. I think it's really interesting that Kenrick had read Mary Wollstonecraft's second Vindication, The Vindication of the Rights of Women, and recommended it to Wodrow, who expected to like it from the reviews he'd read. William Godwin's is probably the most sophisticated book on the list. Thomas Erskine's book was a massive bestseller. It went through 48 editions. It caught the zeitgeist of war weariness in Britain in 1797. And John Robison's book was a Scottish version of the conspiracy theory about secret societies having caused the French Revolution that was sweeping Europe after the Abbé Augustin de Barwell's book on the history of Jacobinism. Second, what's not on the list? There's nothing by Hannah More. That's not surprising because her political material was really aimed at much less sophisticated readers than they were. Nothing by John Bowles, who was an ultra-conservative, probably reflects the tendency of the list towards the reformers. Nothing by John Thelwall, a little bit surprising. There's no poetry here, and generally they enjoyed discussing poetry. They enjoyed William Haley, William Mason, William Cooper, Nothing here of the pro-revolution poetry by Wordsworth, Coleridge or Southey. I think we do need to remember that James Wodrow was a working clergyman who was preaching 3 times a week. They both often complained about not having enough time to read. Why? You read everything thoroughly, and that thoroughly. Well, I read little or nothing, being satisfied with the abridging labours of our periodical writers. That's Kenrick. We know that he sat in his bank and read nice books while he was waiting for the next customer to come in. But they always are complaining they don't have enough time to read. But we need to remember also the volume of newspapers and periodicals that I've already mentioned. And there were novels and theology as well that are not on my list here. So they had to make choices somewhere. I think this is a strikingly representative list of books. So then, how did they consider these books in their letters? And this is my last section. So we start with Richard Price and his discourse on the love of our country. Samuel Kenrick praised Price's calmness in the face of the political opposition that he attracted in this book. Only remember your friend Dr. Price, for you know him personally, I only from his writings. What bitter, what venomous, what hellish invectives are now poured out upon him with cutting sarcasms whose stings are perhaps the most irritating. He seems to smile with sovereign contempt or perhaps pity, for they certainly know not what they do. Unfortunately, we don't have Wodrow's letter to Price of late 1789 or early 1790, but he seems to have written to Price of his delight in the glorious prospect which seemed to be opening through the revolution in France, from Price's reply to him. In September 1790, Kenrick was endorsing Wodrow's, quote, warm panegyric on the French Revolution, which had charmed me and many hearty friends to whom I communicated it. Our hearts and souls beat in unison with you in every word. Again, Wodrow's letter is missing, but it therefore seems likely that both welcomed Price's discourse with enthusiasm. Not so Edmund Burke's reflections on the Revolution in France, also published in 1790 in response to Price's discourse. Unsurprisingly, this drew the most voluminous discussion from both of them, as it did from many writers. So I'm going to spend most time on this. Both deprecated the book. Kenrick was absolutely outraged by it, but eventually he decided that he was grateful to it for the number and quality of replies it attracted and the political points that were thus raised in public. As usual, Wodrow's response was more balanced. I don't mean it was better, I just mean it literally, it was more balanced. The French Revolution. I have read Burke's attack upon it, a much stronger one than I expected from the man whom I had conceived to be a little deranged. It glows with warm eloquence, contains some argument that really deserves the attention of the French patriots and their friends here, but it is stuffed with childish conceits and pedantic wit and satire, with sophistry and prejudices which generally go hand in hand. I have read the plain, sensible observations of the Analytical Review and the smarter and severer strictures of the monthly reviewers, which will lead the way to other more full and masterly confutations of it. I've not finished with Burke, but the next book on their list is Joseph Priestley's letters to the Right Honourable Edmund Burke, his reply to Burke. Wodrow thought that was going to be the best performance that could appear in print in answer to Burke, although he thought, as he usually did with Priestley, he thought him too sharp and not always quite fair to Burke. He was not the fan of Priestley that Kenrick was. But they had a very interesting debate, I think, on the principle of prejudice in Burke over the course of several letters about his book and Priestley's reply. And in Burke, prejudice, I suppose, is simply what we might call subconscious bias. So first, Wodrow said, if Burke had too much respect for the prejudices, the subconscious bias of mankind, The doctor, Priestley, on the other hand, treats him with too much contempt, such as will not answer in the present state of things, and even hurt a great cause he means to serve, forgetting the wisdom and mild condescension of his revered master, Jesus Christ. I have yet many things to say, but ye cannot bear them now, what Jesus said to the disciples the night before he died. Kenrick is incensed by this, and he actually writes a note on the letter to remind himself what to say when he gets round to replying. Memo to self, to refer to Monthly Review April for Capel Loft's answer to Burke, in which Dr. Wodrow will find sentiments very like his own with regard to the indulgence due to old prejudices. When he actually replied to Wodrow, a few days later, he wrote, "You bring me again to Mr. Burke, and the propriety of indulgence to the prejudices of mankind, which you even support with the authority of our divine Lord and Master. It pains me to differ with my worthy friend, but I cannot help thinking he carries his amiable philanthropy too far in this instance. He would rather Wodrow had applied to Burke the severe woes pronounced by Jesus on the Pharisees. This seems to me much more in point, so much is my mind perverted, than yours." Notice the date. Can you see? He's writing on the 20th and 21st of April in 1791, and bearing in mind that it still took a few days for letters to be carried from Birmingham, often via London, through Carlisle and up to Ayrshire. Wodrow's replying on the 29th of April. He's replying very quickly. He had meant his biblical quotation for Priestley's readers, not for Burke. On prejudice, he said, "The doctor, I said, does not sufficiently respect the prejudices of mankind. That is the prejudices of education, the influence of custom, habit, etc., a great definition of prejudice, which are a part and an innocent and useful part of human nature as the ground of order and submission to government, but would lead them only by higher principles before they are sufficiently enlightened to follow them. Burke, on the other hand, lays too much stress on prejudice and custom, so much, in my opinion, as to destroy all difference between right and wrong." And he explained he'd written his letter too quickly, too hastily, and it wasn't clear. And just calm down. There's an interesting discussion, though, on prejudice and its place in argument. Moving on. Thomas Paine, Rights of Man, Part the First. Kenrick thought that if Wodrow thought Priestley was too severe on Burke, he would find Paine even worse, although he himself thought Rights of Man the First immortal. Wodrow simply said that Paine's book had had a great run in this country, Scotland. In fact, on Part 2, he was also more interested in its effects on the Scottish people than in the book itself. I've already mentioned Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Women, and that was Rights of Man, Part 2. William Godwin, Political Justice, published in 1793. This is the book which, along with Burke's reflections, drew forth the longest and most substantial discussion from both of them. And actually, they don't discuss it until 1795. So they're not always reading books hot off the press. Again, they're busy, they're still working, they're reading lots of stuff, they're being hospitable, they're doing lots of other things. And they take the time to read books thoroughly. So they don't always respond hot off the press. So they're writing about Godwin 2 years later, 1795. Both of them thought he was a wonderful writer and actually something of a genius. But they both thought that his ideas on religion, in particular, Godwin's an atheist, were somewhat eccentric. Wodrow is a Church of Scotland minister who tended towards the heterodox. Kenrick is a Unitarian, so he is heterodox, but both of them are thoroughly believers in God. So they think Godwin's a bit eccentric on this. But your critique of Godwin, Kenrick told Wodrow, is accurate, sound, and judicious. And they both generally think he's wonderful. Thomas Paine's Age of Reason, also this is published in 1795, and I think this, together with their discussion of Godwin's book, perhaps suggests why Wodrow had so little to say about Thomas Paine's 2-volume Rights of Man. Of the Age of Reason, he wrote that it was, quote, one of the silliest and most childish books against revealed religion I ever read, and I have read most of them published in Britain, such as Godwin's, about which he was much more complimentary and careful. Kenrick thought Paine's argument in favour of natural religion sublime, but that his arguments against revealed religion were simply groundless and not difficult to confute. Both loved Thomas Erskine's view of the causes and consequences of the war against France, 1797. Both of them loved that one. They noted the editions that they had read. I mentioned it went through 48 editions. Wodrow, pretty pleased, he'd got hold of the 18th edition. He regretted the fact that it was banned in Scotland. I didn't know that. I need to look into this. I don't know any more about that, but I need to go and find out. Kenrick had got hold of the 31st edition. They both think it's great. And then finally on this list, John Robison's book, The Proofs of a Conspiracy Against All the Religions and Governments of Europe, absolutely at the extreme end of conspiracy theories. Both of them had known Robison a little at Glasgow University when he was a student with them. He was a natural philosopher, a physicist, who'd left Glasgow in 1773 for Edinburgh, having had stints in the Navy and elsewhere in between. Wodrow thought the material of this book was handled in the most confused manner you can conceive. After reading a great mass of information attempted to be given, I knew no more of the matter almost than when I began, for want of dates, arrangement, or the smallest attempt to appreciate the credit done to the German books from whence the citations are taken. Again, what is not to love about somebody who wants proper references? I'm not personally acquainted with Robison. He seems to be an amiable man, though far from a clear-headed and candid writer. This was one that Kenrick only knew from reviews and Wodrow's assessment. He thought it sounded as if it was the product of the most violent prejudices, and he had not the time, eyes, or inclination to read it himself. It is most unlikely he would have been convinced had he read it. So finally, Wodrow and Kenrick didn't offer the dramatic swings of opinion that we can see in Anna Seward, but they did certainly modify their ideas and tested them against the publications that they read, in conversations with each other. For instance, that discussion of prejudice via Burke, which in turn could nicely be considered in relation to their own temperaments, characters, life experiences, and so on. Their discussions of what they were reading were not simply the passing comments of friends tracking fashionable publications without much critical understanding. They're the responses of highly cultured readers, sophisticated observers of public affairs, neither of whom was well known in their own day or thereafter, who weren't writing letters for publication, but who had received a fine education at the University of Glasgow, who lived, read and wrote at a level which might be described as somewhere just below the circles of Enlightenment literati who were and are household names, some of whom they knew. They understood their times as being located in a period of progress, which was perhaps at this particular juncture being disrupted. And it's this as much as anything else which made them men of the Enlightenment. And they understood the public events of their lifetimes through that lens.